Jason Caldwell sat in his sleek corner office, the sprawling Manhattan skyline glowing behind him. The gold invitation in his hand felt heavy, almost regal. He leaned back in his leather chair, smirking as he read the embossed words for the 100th time. The union of Jason Caldwell and Vanessa Morgan. This wedding wasn't just an event, it was a spectacle. Every detail had been meticulously planned, not only to celebrate his new beginning, but to showcase his triumph. However, one final touch would make it unforgettable. Did you send it? Jason asked, not looking up. Across the desk, his assistant Olivia shifted uncomfortably. Yes, sir. The courier confirmed it was delivered yesterday. Good, Jason replied, his tone sharp. She'll come. Olivia hesitated. Do you think it's wise to? Jason cut her off. It's not about wisdom, Olivia. It's about closure. He leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. She needs to see the life she could have had, the life she threw away. Claire Bennett sat in her modest apartment in Brooklyn, staring at the gilded envelope on her kitchen table. The invitation lay open, its ornate design mocking her. Unbelievable, Claire muttered, sipping her coffee. Her best friend Natalie, perched on a stool nearby, snatched the invitation and read it aloud with exaggerated drama. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Jason Caldwell and Vanessa Morgan at the Caldwell Estate in Napa Valley. Natalie snorted. The audacity of this man. What's next? A thank you note for divorcing him? Claire shook her head, her dark curls bouncing. He wants me to see him winning. That's what this is about. Natalie leaned forward. You're not actually considering going, are you? Claire hesitated. I don't know. Maybe? Claire, no. Natalie's tone was firm. He's setting you up. He wants to parade his shiny new life in front of you. I know, Claire admitted, but part of me wants to see it, to prove to myself that I'm not the same person anymore. Natalie rolled her eyes. You don't need to prove anything. Let him wallow in his petty games alone. But Claire's mind was already made up. If I don't go, it'll look like I care, like I'm still stuck in the past. I'll go, but not for him. For me, Natalie groaned. Fine, but promise me one thing. What? Don't let him get to you. Walk in there like you own the place. The next day, Jason received confirmation that Claire had RSVP'd. A sly grin spread across his face as he poured himself a glass of scotch. She's coming, he said to no one in particular. His business partner Eric walked into the room and raised an eyebrow. Who's coming? Jason swirled his drink. Claire. Eric let out a low whistle. Man, you really know how to stir the pot. It's not about stirring the pot, Jason said, leaning against his desk. It's about showing her what she lost, Eric smirked. And here I thought weddings were about love. Jason laughed, the sound cold and hollow. Love? That's a myth, Eric. Weddings are about power. Eric shook his head. Well, just make sure Vanessa doesn't catch on to whatever game you're playing. Jason's expression darkened. Vanessa's smart. She knows her role. As Eric left, Jason stared out the window, his grip tightening on his glass. He could already picture Claire's face when she walked into the estate, seeing him standing there with Vanessa. Perfect, poised, and every bit the man Claire once underestimated. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a reckoning. Claire paced her small living room, the invitation still clutched in her hand. The golden edges seemed to mock her with every step she took. Natalie sat cross-legged on the couch, a bowl of popcorn in her lap, watching Claire like she was the star of a particularly dramatic soap opera. You're wearing out the floorboards, Natalie said, tossing a kernel into her mouth. Do you even realize how insane this is? Claire snapped, holding up the invitation. Who invites their ex-wife to their wedding? Who does that? Natalie shrugged. Jason Caldwell, apparently. King of pettiness. Claire groaned, dropping onto the couch beside her. This isn't just about him being petty. It's calculated. He knows exactly what he's doing. Natalie raised an eyebrow. And what is that, exactly? Claire stared at the invitation, her voice dropping. He wants to humiliate me, show me off like some relic of his past life while parading his new upgraded one. Then don't go, Natalie said simply, popping another piece of popcorn into her mouth. Claire sighed, her shoulders slumping. If I don't go, he wins. He'll think I'm hiding or that I'm still bitter. So, you're going just to prove a point? Natalie asked, her tone skeptical. Claire met her gaze, determination hardening her features. No, I'm going to show him I'm not the same person he walked all over during our marriage. I'm stronger now. Natalie leaned back, crossing her arms. All right, but if you're going, you need to do it right. No playing nice. No trying to blend in. You show up, own the room, and then leave him wondering what the hell happened to the Claire he thought he knew. The next morning, Claire stood in front of her closet, staring at the rows of clothes. Nothing seemed right. Too simple, too flashy, too sad. Natalie barged in, a garment bag slung over her shoulder. All right, move over. I'm not letting you show up to your ex-husband's wedding looking like an extra from a rom-com breakup montage. Claire blinked. What is that? Natalie unzipped the bag with a flourish, revealing a sleek black dress with an open back and a subtle shimmer. This is your armor. Try it on. Claire hesitated. It's a bit much, don't you think? Natalie rolled her eyes. Claire, this isn't about blending in. This is about walking into that vineyard looking like the goddess of his worst regrets. Reluctantly, Claire slipped into the dress. When she turned to face the mirror, even she was surprised. The woman staring back at her looked nothing like the Claire Bennett who had crumbled under Jason's control. This woman was confident, powerful. Natalie grinned. Oh yeah, he's not ready for this. Later that evening, Claire called her sister, Emma. I need your honest opinion, Claire said as soon as Emma picked up. About what? Emma asked, her voice tinged with concern. Claire hesitated, twisting the phone cord in her fingers. About going to Jason's wedding. There was a pause. He invited you? Yeah, Claire said. I'm trying to decide if I should go. Emma's voice softened. Claire, you don't owe him anything. You've moved on. You don't need to prove that to anyone. I know, Claire said quietly, but I feel like I need to do this for me, to close that chapter for good. Emma sighed. Then go. But promise me one thing. What? Don't let him get in your head. You're so much stronger than he ever gave you credit for. Claire smiled. Thanks, Em. I needed to hear that. As the day of the wedding approached, Claire felt a strange mix of nerves and excitement. She wasn't just going to Jason's wedding. She was stepping back into a world she'd left behind, but this time on her own terms. Standing in front of the mirror one last time before leaving, she adjusted the dress and took a deep breath. All right, Jason, she said to her reflection, her voice steady. Let's see who really has the upper hand now. Jason Caldwell stood in the center of the grand hall at the Caldwell estate, the final touches for the wedding being meticulously arranged around him. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the rich scent of fresh roses filled the air. Every detail screamed perfection, and Jason wouldn't settle for less. Mr. Caldwell, his wedding planner Marissa, called, clipboard in hand. The florists are finishing up. The caterers are setting up the cocktail bar outside. Everything is on schedule. Jason barely glanced at her. His attention was fixed on the room, imagining it filled with guests, all eyes on him. Good. Make sure the champagne is flowing before the ceremony. People get generous with their compliments when they're holding a glass of bubbly. Marissa hesitated, sensing his distraction. Are you expecting any surprises today? Jason smirked, his eyes narrowing. Not surprises, but I am expecting someone. Marissa tilted her head. Claire? Of course, Jason said, his voice smooth. She RSVP'd. She's coming. Marissa didn't respond immediately. She had worked with Jason long enough to recognize when he was scheming. And what exactly is your goal here, Jason? Jason turned to face her, his smile sharp and calculated. Closure, Marissa. Claire needs to see what she missed out on, and I need her to know that I've moved on, that I've won. Marissa raised an eyebrow. And Vanessa? Does she know you're using your wedding as a stage for personal revenge? Jason's jaw tightened, but his smile didn't falter. Vanessa understands the game. She knows what's at stake. This is more than a wedding. It's a statement. Marissa didn't press further, but her unease lingered. Well, I hope it all goes according to your plan. It always does, Jason said confidently, turning back to the room. Later, Jason sat with his best man, Eric, in the estate's study. The room was filled with the aroma of aged whiskey and leather-bound books, a place where Jason often plotted his next big move, both in business and in life. You look too calm, Eric said, pouring them both a glass of scotch. Jason leaned back in his chair, taking the glass. Why wouldn't I be? Everything is falling into place. Eric took a sip, watching him closely. Everything, huh? Even Claire? Jason's smile faltered for a brief second before he masked it. Claire is irrelevant. She's a relic of my past. Eric smirked. Is that why you've been obsessing over her RSVP? Face it, man. You didn't invite her for closure. You invited her because she still gets under your skin. Jason's grip tightened on his glass. She doesn't get under my skin. She's just a loose end I'm tying up. Eric leaned forward, his tone light but probing. If she's so irrelevant, why bother inviting her at all? Why not just focus on Vanessa and the future you're building? Jason set his glass down a little too forcefully, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Because Claire needs to see that I don't need her, that I've succeeded without her. Eric leaned back, raising his hands in surrender. All right, all right. Just don't let this little loose end ruin your big day. Vanessa won't take kindly to playing second fiddle to your grudge. Jason didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the window overlooking the estate grounds. The truth Eric hinted at was something Jason wasn't ready to admit, even to himself. As the day went on, Jason found himself growing more restless. Every detail was perfect, every element in place. But the thought of Claire's arrival gnawed at him. Would she come alone? Would she try to blend into the crowd, or would she attempt to make some kind of statement? When Vanessa entered the room, her radiant smile momentarily distracted him. She wore a stunning ivory gown, her hair swept into an elegant updo. Jason, she said, wrapping her arms around him. Everything looks amazing. You've outdone yourself. He smiled down at her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It's all for you. Vanessa tilted her head, studying him. You seem distracted. Is everything okay? Of course, Jason replied quickly, kissing her forehead. Just making sure everything goes off without a hitch. Vanessa's smile faltered slightly, but she didn't press. All right, I'll leave you to your final preparations. Just don't keep me waiting at the altar. Jason chuckled, watching her leave. As soon as the door closed behind her, his smile faded. His mind drifted back to Claire, imagining her walking through the grand entrance. The thought sent a thrill of both anxiety and anticipation through him. Whatever happened today, he knew one thing for sure. Claire's presence would be unforgettable. Whether she realized it or not, this wasn't just a wedding. It was a reckoning. The Caldwell estate in Napa Valley was a place that seemed pulled straight out of a fairy tale. Acres of vineyards stretched out under a golden California sun, the lush greenery sparkling with dew from the early morning mist. The estate itself, a sprawling mansion with grand archways and towering columns, sat at the center like a crown jewel. Every detail had been curated to perfection, from the cascading floral arrangements to the golden ribbons adorning the white chairs neatly arranged for the ceremony. Claire arrived just as the final touches were being made. The car ride had been quiet, almost somber, but as she stepped out onto the gravel driveway, a strange calm washed over her. She smoothed her dress, adjusted her posture, and took a deep breath. You've got this, she whispered to herself. Inside, Jason was giving last-minute instructions to his staff when a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. Turning toward the grand doors, his heart skipped a beat. There she was. Claire Bennett walked in with the kind of poise that could stop a room. Her dress was simple but striking, hugging her figure just enough to emphasize her confidence without overstating it. Her dark hair was pulled back elegantly, and her gaze was steady as it swept over the room. Jason froze for a moment, then quickly regained his composure. He motioned for Marissa, who was coordinating the arrival of guests. She's here, he said, his voice low but taut. Marissa followed his gaze. I see that. She doesn't look like the woman you described. Jason didn't respond. He watched as Claire moved through the room, her expression neutral, almost bored, as though the grandeur surrounding her was unimpressive. Meanwhile, Claire scanned the venue, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The extravagance was undeniable, but it felt hollow to her, like a desperate attempt to prove something. Claire? A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Eric, Jason's best man. He gave her a lopsided smile, holding a glass of champagne. Well, if it isn't the guest of honor, Eric said, offering her the glass. Claire raised an eyebrow but accepted it. I doubt Jason sees me that way. Eric chuckled, lowering his voice. You're braver than I thought. Showing up here, most people would have run the other way. Claire took a sip of the champagne, savoring its crisp flavor. I'm not most people. No, Eric said, studying her. You're definitely not. Their conversation was interrupted by the orchestra starting up outside. Guests began to file toward the ceremony area, and Claire felt her stomach tighten. Jason stood at the altar, his back straight and his smile polished. Vanessa made her way down the aisle, radiant in her designer gown. The guests murmured their approval, but Jason barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, his eyes darting toward Claire, who had taken a seat near the back. Vanessa reached his side, slipping her arm through his. She whispered, "You're distracted." Jason forced a smile. "Just taking it all in." Vanessa gave him a pointed look but said nothing, turning her attention back to the officiant. As the ceremony progressed, Claire watched with a mix of curiosity and detachment. She noted how Vanessa seemed composed, but caught the flicker of doubt in her eyes whenever Jason's attention wavered. The vows were about to begin when Claire felt an unexpected surge of anger. Jason stood there, basking in his curated image, while she had spent years rebuilding her life from the wreckage he'd left behind. Before she could stop herself, Claire rose from her seat and began walking toward the front. The movement caught Jason's eye, and his confident facade faltered. Vanessa followed his gaze, her smile fading. The room grew quiet as Claire reached the altar, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome. "Claire," Jason said, his voice strained. "What are you doing?" Claire stopped, her gaze steady. "I couldn't help but notice you forgot something in your vows." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Claire didn't flinch. Vanessa turned to Jason, her expression a mix of confusion and anger. "What is she talking about?" Claire smiled faintly, her voice calm but cutting. "I'm talking about the truth, Jason, about the lies you've built your life around." Jason's face turned pale, and Vanessa stepped back, suddenly unsure of the man she was about to marry. "What's going on here?" Vanessa demanded, her voice rising. Claire tilted her head slightly. "Jason invited me here to humiliate me, to prove he's moved on. But what he doesn't realize is that I've already moved on, and unlike him, I don't need an audience for it." The room was silent, all eyes on Jason as his carefully constructed world began to crack. Claire turned to Vanessa, her tone softening. "I don't envy you, Vanessa, but I hope you see him for who he really is before it's too late." Without another word, Claire turned and walked away, leaving Jason standing at the altar, exposed and speechless. The tension in the room was palpable. Claire's words had sent shockwaves through the gathering, and the silence that followed was deafening. Jason stood frozen at the altar, his mind racing to regain control of the situation. Vanessa looked between him and Claire, her composure slipping as doubt crept into her expression. Claire, meanwhile, remained calm. She didn't flinch under the weight of dozens of eyes watching her. She had come here prepared for this moment, though even she hadn't anticipated stepping forward during the ceremony. Jason finally broke the silence, his voice tight. "Claire, this is hardly the time or place." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time," Claire interrupted smoothly. Her voice was steady, carrying through the room without effort. She turned her gaze to Vanessa. "I'm sorry, Vanessa. This isn't about you. I promise, you deserve better than what's happening here." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "What is she talking about, Jason?" Jason opened his mouth, but no words came. His usual charm, his ability to spin any situation to his favor, failed him now. Claire took advantage of his hesitation. "You see," Claire continued, addressing the crowd now, "Jason invited me here today to humiliate me. He wanted to parade his new life in front of me, to show me what I lost." Her lips curved into a faint, sardonic smile. "But what he doesn't understand is that I didn't lose anything when I left him. I gained something far more valuable, myself." The room erupted into whispers, and Jason's face flushed with anger. He stepped toward Claire, his voice low and menacing. "You've made your point. Leave." Claire stood her ground, her chin lifting slightly. "Oh, I'm not finished." Vanessa crossed her arms, her icy demeanor cracking as her voice cut through the tension. "Jason, is this true? Did you invite her here to humiliate her?" Jason's jaw clenched. "This is being blown out of proportion." "Answer the question," Vanessa demanded, her tone sharper now. Jason hesitated, and that pause spoke louder than any words. Vanessa's expression hardened, and she stepped back from him, putting distance between them. Claire turned to face Vanessa directly. "He doesn't see people, Vanessa. He sees pawns. You're smart, successful, and beautiful. Everything he can use to elevate his own status. I know because I was once in your shoes. I believed in him, trusted him, and thought we were building something real. But Jason's only loyalty is to his image." Vanessa's fingers tightened around the bouquet in her hands. "Is that true, Jason? Am I just another accessory to you?" Jason's voice rose, his frustration spilling out. "This is ridiculous." Claire is bitter and trying to ruin my day. Claire let out a dry laugh. Bitter? Hardly. If I wanted to ruin your day, Jason, I wouldn't have come at all. I came here to show you and everyone else that I've moved on, that you don't have power over me anymore. Jason pointed a finger at her, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger. You're making a fool of yourself. Claire met his gaze, unflinching. No, Jason. I'm making a point. You can build all the mansions you want, surround yourself with all the right people, and marry someone who looks perfect on paper. But it won't change the fact that you're hollow inside. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice cold. Jason, is there any truth to what she's saying? Did you invite her here just to show off? Jason ran a hand through his hair, struggling to form an answer. Vanessa, don't listen to her. She's twisting everything. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line, her disappointment evident. You didn't deny it. Jason reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Vanessa! Enough, Vanessa said, her voice firm. She turned to Claire, her expression softening slightly. Thank you for saying what needed to be said. Claire gave her a small nod. You deserve the truth. Vanessa dropped the bouquet on the floor and took a step back from Jason. I'm not going to be part of whatever game this is. Jason's eyes widened. Vanessa, wait. But she didn't wait. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jason standing alone at the altar. The whispers among the guests grew louder, but Claire ignored them. She turned on her heel, her head held high, and made her way toward the exit. As she reached the door, Eric stepped into her path. Claire, he said, his tone low, that was something. She paused, looking at him with a faint smile. Someone had to say it. Eric studied her for a moment before stepping aside. Good luck, Claire. Thanks, she said, her voice steady. I don't need luck anymore. With that, Claire walked out into the sunlight, leaving Jason to face the consequences of his actions. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. The late afternoon sun bathed the Napa Valley estate in a golden glow as Claire stepped outside. The vineyard stretched endlessly before her, serene and untouched by the drama that had just unfolded inside. Her heart was racing, but she felt lighter, as though she'd left something heavy behind in that room. As she walked toward the parking area, she heard footsteps behind her. Claire turned, half expecting Jason, but instead it was Eric. Claire, he called, jogging to catch up. His tie was loosened, and his expression was a mix of admiration and disbelief. You really know how to make an exit. Claire smirked faintly. Wasn't exactly the plan, but it felt right. He chuckled, shaking his head. You realize you just dismantled years of Jason's carefully curated image in less than 10 minutes. She shrugged, her confidence unwavering. He had it coming, and honestly, it felt good. Eric studied her for a moment, asked his usual playful demeanor, giving way to something more sincere. You know, not many people would have had the guts to do what you just did. Most would have stayed quiet, avoided the confrontation. Claire raised an eyebrow. That's exactly what Jason was counting on. He thought I'd sit quietly in the back, maybe even leave early. He's used to controlling the narrative. Not this time. Eric nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. I have to admit, it was kind of impressive. Claire turned toward her car, her hand resting on the door handle. Well, I should probably go before I make more of a scene. Wait, Eric said, his tone suddenly serious. Can I ask you something? She paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. What? Why did you really come today? I mean, I get the closure thing, but it had to be more than that. Claire sighed, leaning against the car. For the first time, her composed exterior softened. I needed to remind myself of who I've become. For years, Jason made me feel small, like I wasn't enough. I let that define me for too long. Coming here wasn't about him. It was about me proving to myself that I've grown past all of it. Eric nodded slowly. Well, mission accomplished. Inside the estate, Jason stood alone at the altar, the whispers of the remaining guests swirling around him. He clenched his fists, his jaw tight as he tried to process what had just happened. Vanessa's departure, Claire's words, they echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. Marissa approached cautiously, clipboard in hand. Jason, the guests are starting to leave. Should we? Cancel it, Jason snapped, his voice sharp. Marissa blinked, startled. The reception? All of it, he said, his tone colder now. It's over. Marissa hesitated, then nodded. Understood. As she walked away, Jason sat down heavily on one of the chairs, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt something he didn't recognize: regret. Meanwhile, Claire drove away from the estate, the wind tugging at her hair through the open window. She hadn't felt this free in years, but a part of her couldn't stop thinking about everything that had just happened. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Picking it up, she saw a text from Natalie. "How did it go? Did you make it out alive?" Claire smiled, typing back quickly. "Better than I expected. Drinks tonight?" Natalie's reply came almost instantly. "You're buying." Claire laughed softly, feeling a warmth she hadn't in years. Later that evening, as Claire sat at a cozy bar in San Francisco, sipping on a glass of wine, she noticed someone enter out of the corner of her eye. It was Eric. "What are you doing here?" Claire asked, surprised. Eric grinned, sliding onto the stool next to her. "Saw your car outside. Figured I'd check if you survived the aftermath." Claire shook her head, a small laugh escaping her lips. "Barely." They sat in silence for a moment before Eric spoke again. "You know, you've got a pretty impressive way of shaking things up." Claire raised her glass in a mock toast. "Here's to starting over." Eric clinked his glass against hers, his eyes warm. "To new beginnings." As they talked, Claire felt something shift within her. A sense of hope, a feeling that the future, for the first time in a long time, was hers to shape. Jason, back at the estate, stared out at the darkened vineyard. His phone buzzed with messages and missed calls, but he ignored them all. For the first time, he had no plan, no strategy. He was alone with his thoughts, and for once, he couldn't escape them. Claire's words echoed in his mind. "You're hollow inside." He didn't want to admit it, but she was right, and for the first time, he wondered if there was a way to change that. As the night deepened, Claire found herself smiling more, laughing freely as she and Eric talked about everything but Jason. For once, she wasn't looking back, only forward. It was a new beginning, and Claire was finally ready to embrace it. Jason sat alone in his study, the remnants of the day's chaos still echoing in his mind. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering flames in the marble fireplace. On the desk before him sat a half-empty glass of whiskey and the guest list for the wedding that never was. The gold-embossed paper seemed to mock him now. His phone buzzed incessantly on the desk, but he ignored it. He already knew who was calling: Vanessa, Eric, his PR manager, and probably a dozen curious guests. He didn't want to talk to any of them. Instead, Jason picked up the glass and stared into its amber depths, his thoughts consumed by Claire's words. "You're hollow inside." Her voice lingered in his mind, cutting through his usual armor of confidence and control. For the first time, Jason felt exposed, not just to others, but to himself. The door to the study creaked open, and Eric stepped inside without knocking. He leaned casually against the doorframe, his tie undone and a bottle of scotch in hand. "You look like hell," Eric said, his tone light but probing. Jason didn't look up. "What do you want?" Eric shrugged, walking over and pouring himself a drink. "Just checking on you. Thought you might need some company." Jason let out a humorless laugh. "Company? I thought you'd be out celebrating with Claire by now." Eric raised an eyebrow. "You think this is funny?" Jason's jaw tightened. "I think it's ironic. The one person I tried to bury just dug me out instead." Eric sat down across from him, setting his glass on the desk. "She didn't bury you, Jason. You did that to yourself." Jason shot him a sharp look. "Thanks for the insight, Dr. Phil." Eric ignored the sarcasm. "You know, for someone who prides himself on always being one step ahead, you really underestimated her." Jason leaned back in his chair, his gaze finally meeting Eric's. "What do you want me to say? That I messed up? That she got the better of me? Fine. She did. Happy now?" Eric shook his head. "This isn't about her winning or you losing. This is about you finally facing the fact that you've spent your entire life trying to prove something to people who don't even matter." Jason frowned, the weight of Eric's words sinking in. "What's your point?" "My point," Eric said, leaning forward, "is that you've been so focused on building this perfect image, perfect wife, perfect career, perfect life, that you've completely lost sight of who you are. Or maybe you never knew." Jason was silent, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. Eric sighed, standing up and finishing his drink. "Look, man, you've got two choices. You can keep pretending everything's fine and end up exactly where you are now, alone and miserable. Or you can start figuring out what the hell you actually want out of life." He paused at the door, glancing back. And maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to fix some of the damage you've done. The next morning, Jason woke to sunlight streaming through the windows. His head pounded from the whiskey, but the real ache was deeper, an emptiness he couldn't shake. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through the messages. Vanessa had left a single text. "I deserve better than this. Don't contact me again." Jason let out a long breath, closing his eyes. She was right. Vanessa deserved better, and for the first time, he wondered if Claire had felt the same when she left him. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Olivia, his assistant, peeked inside. "Jason, there's someone here to see you." Jason frowned. "Who?" "Claire," Olivia said, her tone cautious. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He stood quickly, straightening his shirt. "Send her in." Claire entered the study with the same poise she'd had the day before. She wore a simple blazer and jeans, but her presence filled the room. Jason gestured toward a chair, but she shook her head. "I won't stay long," she said, her tone neutral. "I just came to say what I didn't get to yesterday." Jason swallowed, the weight of her words already pressing down on him. "I'm listening." Claire crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "I didn't come to your wedding to hurt you, Jason. I came to remind myself that I'm not the same person you tried to control. But after seeing you yesterday, I realized something else." Jason raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "You're not the man I thought you were," Claire said, her voice soft but firm. "You're not strong. You're not invincible. You're just lost." Jason flinched but didn't argue. Claire took a step closer, her expression softening. "I don't hate you, Jason. I did for a long time, but not anymore. I've moved on, and maybe it's time you did too." Jason nodded slowly, his throat tight. "I don't know how." Claire studied him for a moment, then gave him a small, sad smile. "That's for you to figure out, but I hope, for your sake, you do." She turned to leave, but Jason called after her. "Claire?" She paused, looking back. "Thank you," he said quietly. Claire nodded once before walking out, leaving Jason alone in the study. As the door closed behind her, Jason sat back down, staring at the empty chair where Claire had stood. For the first time in years, he didn't feel anger or resentment, just a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope. Maybe Eric was right. Maybe it wasn't too late to fix the damage. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to fix himself. Vanessa sat alone in her suite at the luxury hotel downtown. The once pristine white dress she'd worn for what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life was draped over the back of a chair. It felt tainted now, a symbol of a future she no longer wanted. She stared at the text Jason had sent hours earlier. "Vanessa, please, let me explain. I made a mistake, but we can fix this." Her finger hovered over the delete button. The temptation to reply lingered, but she reminded herself of the truth. Jason wasn't the man she thought he was. He was manipulative, calculating, and incapable of truly valuing anyone other than himself. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Vanessa hesitated, then walked to the door and opened. Standing there was her best friend, Sophia, dressed casually but with an unmistakable look of concern on her face. "I came as soon as I heard," Sophia said, stepping inside. "You okay?" Vanessa shrugged, sitting back down on the edge of the bed. "I don't know. Part of me feels like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. The other part is just relieved it's over." Sophia sat beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You're not an idiot, Vanessa. Jason's good at playing the perfect man. He fooled everyone, including me." Vanessa let out a bitter laugh. "Claire tried to warn me. Not directly, but everything she said yesterday, it made me realize I've been blind. Jason didn't love me. He loved the idea of me. He used me to make himself look better." Sophia nodded. "So what now? Are you going to talk to him?" Vanessa shook her head. "There's nothing left to say. If I give him another chance, it'll just be more of the same. He'll apologize, make promises, and then go right back to being who he's always been. I deserve more than that." Sophia smiled softly. "You do, and I'm proud of you for seeing it." Vanessa exhaled deeply, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I just need to figure out what's next. I spent so much time planning a life with him that I don't know what my life looks like without him." Sophia gave her a reassuring squeeze. "You'll figure it out. You're strong, Vanessa. You didn't get to where you are by depending on anyone else." Vanessa smiled faintly. "I guess it's time to prove that to myself." Meanwhile, Jason paced the length of his study, phone in hand. The unanswered text to Vanessa stared back at him like an accusation. He had sent another message after the first one, a longer plea for forgiveness, but there was still no response. He threw the phone onto the desk with a frustrated groan. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Vanessa was supposed to stand by him, to help him rebuild after Claire's stunt. Instead, she had walked away, leaving him to face the fallout alone. Eric entered without knocking, as he often did. Jason barely glanced at him. Still no word from Vanessa? Eric asked, leaning against the doorframe. Jason scowled. Why are you here? To gloat? Eric shrugged. No, just checking in. Figured you could use a reality check. Jason shot him a glare. I don't need your advice right now. Eric crossed his arms, his expression calm but firm. You need something, Jason, because whatever you've been doing clearly isn't working. Jason turned away, staring out the window. She won't talk to me. She won't even give me a chance to explain. What's there to explain? Eric asked, his tone pointed. You used her, Jason. You didn't love her. You loved what she could do for you. Jason's shoulders sagged. For once, he didn't argue. Eric softened slightly, stepping closer. Look, I'm not saying you're a lost cause, but if you want to fix things, not just with Vanessa, but with yourself, you need to start being honest about who you are and what you want. Jason turned to face him, his voice quiet. And what if I don't know who I am anymore? Eric gave him a small, almost sad smile. Then maybe it's time you figured that out. Later that evening, Vanessa sat on the balcony of her suite, a glass of wine in hand. The city lights. Vanessa sat on the edge of the balcony, her glass of wine untouched beside her. The view of the city below was mesmerizing, yet her thoughts were miles away. Jason's texts remained unanswered on her phone, the words blending into meaningless apologies she couldn't bring herself to read again. The sound of her hotel room door opening startled her. She turned quickly, her heart racing, only to see Sophia step in with an exasperated look. You could at least lock your door, Sophia said, closing it behind her. Vanessa exhaled. I figured you'd come back. Sophia plopped onto the armchair near the window. Of course, I came back. You're sitting here stewing in silence when you should be celebrating your freedom. Vanessa let out a dry laugh. Celebrating feels more like mourning. Sophia crossed her arms, studying her friend. You're not mourning, Jason. You're mourning the idea of what you thought your life would be with him. Vanessa looked down at her hands, the weight of Sophia's words hitting her. Maybe. But what does that leave me with now? I built everything around him. The plans, the future, all gone. Sophia leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. It leaves you with a clean slate. You're not starting from scratch, Vanessa. You're starting from experience. You have everything you need to rebuild, but this time, it's about you, not someone else's version of your life. Vanessa blinked, letting the idea settle. I don't even know where to start. Sophia smiled. One step at a time. But first, how about we delete those texts from Jason? Vanessa hesitated, then picked up her phone. She opened the message thread, her finger hovering over the delete button. What if I'm making a mistake? Sophia gave her a pointed look. Vanessa, the only mistake you'd make is going back to someone who didn't value you. He's not your future. With a deep breath, Vanessa tapped the button. The messages disappeared, and with them, a small part of the weight she'd been carrying. Jason, meanwhile, sat in the quiet of his study, staring at the empty screen of his phone. The house felt cavernous without the hum of staff or the clinking of glasses that had filled it the day before. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. He looked up to see Eric entering again, this time holding a folder. What now? Jason asked, his tone resigned. Eric dropped the folder onto the desk. I pulled some numbers from your company. Figured you'd want to see where you stand. Jason opened the folder and scanned the contents. His frown deepened with every page. These projections? They're worse than I thought, Jason muttered. Your image has always been your greatest asset, Eric said. But after yesterday, the cracks are starting to show. Investors are pulling back, and the press isn't exactly painting you in the best light. Jason clenched his fists. So what do I do? How do I fix this? Eric leaned against the desk, his expression serious. You don't fix it by throwing money at the problem or spinning another narrative. You fix it by being real, for once. Jason scoffed. Real? What does that even mean? Eric sighed. It means owning your mistakes. You've been so busy building this facade of perfection that you've lost touch with the truth. People don't want perfect, Jason. They want authenticity. Jason leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. And how am I supposed to do that? Just walk out there and admit I'm a fraud? Eric shook his head. Not a fraud, a flawed human being. Start with the people who matter, like Vanessa. Jason tensed at her name. She won't talk to me. Then find a way to make her listen, Eric said. But only if you're ready to tell her the truth. No more games, no more manipulation. Later that evening, Vanessa found herself walking along the waterfront. The cool breeze a welcome relief from the turmoil of her thoughts. She stopped at a small bench overlooking the bay and sat down, watching the waves lap against the shore. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until a voice spoke softly. Vanessa? She turned, startled, to see Jason standing a few feet away. He looked different, less polished, more vulnerable. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice cautious. Jason hesitated, his hands shoved into his pockets. I needed to see you, to say what I should have said a long time ago. Vanessa crossed her arms. I'm not interested in more excuses. It's not an excuse, Jason said quickly. It's the truth. And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to hear this. She studied him for a moment, then sighed. Fine, say what you need to say. Jason sat on the bench beside her, his gaze fixed on the water. I was wrong, about everything, about us. I used you, Vanessa. I didn't value you the way I should have, and for that, I'm sorry. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. And why should I believe you now? Jason met her gaze, his voice earnest. Because I've lost everything. And for the first time, I see how much of that is my fault. You deserve better than what I gave you. Vanessa was silent, her expression unreadable. Jason continued, his tone softer. I don't expect you to take me back. I just needed to tell you the truth. You were never the problem. I was. Vanessa looked away, her thoughts a whirlwind. Finally, she stood, turning to face him. Thank you for saying that, but I can't go back, Jason. I've moved on, and I need to keep moving forward. Jason nodded, his eyes filled with regret. I understand. I hope you find the happiness you deserve. Vanessa offered him a small, sad smile. I hope you do too. As she walked away, Jason remained on the bench, watching her disappear into the night. For the first time in years, he felt something other than control or ambition. He felt the weight of his mistakes and the faint glimmer of a chance to change. Claire leaned against the counter of her favorite coffee shop, the familiar aroma of roasted beans filling the air. She stirred her latte absent-mindedly, her mind replaying the events of Jason's wedding. Though it had only been a few days, it felt like a lifetime ago. Earth to Claire, Natalie's voice cut through her thoughts as she slid into the seat across from her. Claire blinked, focusing on her friend. Sorry, what? Natalie smirked, crossing her arms. You've been staring at that coffee like it personally offended you. What's going on in that head of yours? Claire exhaled, setting the spoon down. It's just everything. The wedding, Jason, what I said. It felt good in the moment, but now I'm wondering if it really changed anything. Natalie raised an eyebrow. You're kidding, right? Claire, you walked into that circus, took control of the narrative, and left Jason standing there with his ego in shreds. If that's not change, I don't know what is. Claire gave a small smile but shook her head. It's not about him, Nat. It's about me. I thought walking away from that mess would feel like closure, but instead, it feels like there's still something unresolved. Natalie leaned forward, her tone serious now. Unresolved how? Claire hesitated, searching for the right words. I think I'm still letting him live rent-free in my head. What happened at the wedding wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was supposed to be my way of moving forward. But now I'm stuck thinking about all the ways I could have done it differently. Natalie nodded slowly. So what are you going to do about it? I don't know, Claire admitted. But I can't keep letting my past define my future. Later that day, Claire found herself walking through Central Park, the crisp autumn air nipping at her cheeks. She stopped at a small bridge overlooking a pond, her reflection rippling in the water below. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Michael, an old friend she'd reconnected with recently. Hey, Claire, free for dinner tonight? I found this little Italian place I think you'd love. Claire stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. Sure. What time? That evening, Claire met Michael at a cozy restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The warm glow of candlelight reflected off the brick walls, and the sound of soft jazz created a soothing ambiance. Michael stood as she approached, a genuine smile lighting up his face. "Hey, you look great." "Thanks," Claire said, sliding into the chair across from him. "This place is amazing. How'd you find it?" Michael chuckled, pouring her a glass of wine. "Let's just say I know a guy who knows a guy." Claire laughed, feeling some of the tension she'd been carrying ease. They talked about everything but Jason, their favorite books, their travel dreams, and the little quirks of city life. At one point, Michael leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure," Claire said, setting down her fork. "What made you walk away from all of it?" "From Jason, I mean." Claire took a sip of wine, gathering her thoughts. "I walked away because I realized I was losing myself. Being with Jason felt like constantly trying to measure up to his expectations, and no matter what I did, it was never enough. I had to choose between staying and becoming someone I didn't recognize or leaving and figuring out who I really am." Michael nodded, his gaze steady. "That takes a lot of courage." "Maybe," Claire said with a shrug, "but it's still a work in progress." Michael smiled. "Aren't we all?" Meanwhile, Jason sat in his now empty home, staring at the stack of paperwork on his desk. His company was stabilizing, but his personal life remained a mess. He picked up a pen and began writing, the words flowing onto the page as though they'd been waiting to escape. "Claire, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. For years, I've blamed you for the way things ended between us. I told myself it was your fault that you couldn't handle my world. But the truth is, I couldn't handle losing control. And you saw through the image I worked so hard to build. That terrified me. When I invited you to the wedding, I thought I was proving something. To you, to myself. But what you said that day made me realize I've been running from the truth for a long time. I don't know who I am without the facade, but I think it's time I find out. Thank you for being honest with me, even when I didn't deserve it. You were the one person who ever really saw me, and I was too blind to appreciate it. I hope you found the happiness you deserve." Jason set the pen down, rereading the letter before folding it carefully and placing it in an envelope. He didn't know if he'd send it, but writing it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. As the night wore on, Claire and Michael left the restaurant, walking side by side through the quiet streets. The conversation flowed easily, and for the first time in a long time, Claire felt a sense of peace. "You know," Michael said, glancing at her, "whatever you're searching for, I think you're closer to finding it than you realize." Claire smiled, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "Maybe I am." For the first time, she wasn't looking back. Instead, she was stepping forward, ready to embrace whatever came next. The days following Jason's letter felt strangely quiet for Claire, as if the world had taken a collective breath. The weight that had been hanging over her was gone, but so was the certainty she'd once had about her path forward. Even though she'd made the decision to move on from Jason, part of her still felt the sting of what had happened. She sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee as the early morning sunlight filtered through the window. Her phone buzzed beside her, snapping her out of her reverie. It was a message from Michael. "Morning, coffee?" Claire smiled, typing back quickly. "Of course, you know the place." Half an hour later, Claire entered the cozy cafe where she and Michael had first met. The barista waved as she approached, recognizing her from their previous visits. "Your usual?" he asked, already preparing her latte. "Yes, please," she said, taking a seat at the corner table, the one with the view of the street. As she settled in, Michael walked in, his easy grin lighting up the room. He made his way to the table, a coffee cup in hand. "Morning, Claire. How's the day treating you?" She smiled up at him, feeling the weight of the past few weeks begin to shift. "Better now. I've been thinking a lot, actually. Good thoughts or bad thoughts?" Michael asked as he sat down across from her. "Good, I think," Claire replied. She paused, considering the words carefully. "I've been looking back, trying to understand where I've been, and now I think I finally know what I need to do next." Michael raised an eyebrow. "That's a pretty big revelation. You're not going back to Jason, are you?" Claire laughed softly, shaking her head. "No, I've let go of that chapter. But I've realized that I need to fully embrace what's ahead, not just with work or friendships, but with myself. I've been holding back, but I can't keep waiting for things to magically fall into place. I need to take charge. Michael leaned forward, intrigued. So what's your first step? Claire took a deep breath, her gaze focused on the street outside. I'm going to start fresh, not just physically, but mentally. I'm going to let go of old doubts, embrace new opportunities, and stop doubting whether I deserve good things. You deserve every good thing that comes your way, Claire? Michael said quietly. Her smile softened at his words, grateful for his unspoken support. Thank you. It feels good to hear that. But it's time I really believe it. Jason, meanwhile, was on a different path entirely. He sat at his desk, staring at the letter he had written to Claire, still unmailed. The words felt true, but there was something about sending them that seemed like an admission of defeat. He had spent so much of his life trying to control his surroundings, his relationships, his business, that the idea of letting go was terrifying. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was his assistant, Olivia. Jason, your 2 p.m. meeting is ready. Are you still on track? Jason read the message, hesitated, and then replied, I'll be there in 15 minutes. But even as he typed the message, his mind drifted back to Claire. What had he really lost? Not just her, but himself. The man who had invited her to his wedding to make a point was not the man he wanted to be. That evening, as Claire sat in her apartment, her mind still buzzing with the weight of her decision, the doorbell rang. She opened the door, surprised to see Natalie standing there, holding a small bag. Surprise! Natalie grinned, stepping in before Claire could react. I thought we could have a little celebration, dinner, wine, and... She pulled out a bottle of red. This. Claire laughed, shaking her head. You didn't have to bring wine. Oh, please, I know you're not going to make it through this evening without it. Natalie's eyes sparkled with mischief. Now, tell me everything. I can see the glow in your eyes, which means you've made a decision. Claire sighed, leaning back on the couch. I have. I'm done with second-guessing myself. I'm letting go of the past and stepping into the future. It's time to really build something for myself. For the first time in a long time, I'm going to do it for me. Natalie's smile softened, and she opened the bottle of wine. That's the best decision you could make. You've been carrying that weight for far too long. Let's drink to new beginnings. The two clinked glasses, and Claire allowed herself to savor the moment. It wasn't just a toast to the future. It was a celebration of self-discovery, of reclaiming control over her own life. The following weeks brought small changes that were slowly building into something bigger. Claire started re-engaging with her work, taking on projects she'd previously turned down. She took long walks in the mornings, something she had always wanted to do but had neglected in the rush of daily life. She also met new people, made new connections, and found that her world was beginning to expand in ways she hadn't imagined. Jason, on the other hand, spent his days in meetings, pushing through the motions of his business without the satisfaction he had once gotten from it. The realization that he was now the one who needed to change nagged at him, but his pride kept him from making the first real move. One afternoon, as Claire was leaving her office, she received a message from Michael. Dinner tonight? I think we both deserve a treat. Let's talk about what's next. Claire smiled and typed back. I'll be there. Let's make it a celebration. As she stepped out into the bright evening, her heart felt light. The journey she had started months ago had finally led her to this point, not with all the answers, but with the knowledge that she was on the right path. Claire stood on the balcony of her new apartment, the city lights shimmering in the distance. It had been months since Jason's wedding, and life had shifted in ways she never anticipated. The air carried the crispness of autumn, and the faint sounds of the bustling streets below reminded her of how far she'd come. Inside, the faint hum of jazz played as Michael set the table for dinner. He had insisted on cooking tonight, promising Claire a meal she'd never forget. You know, Claire said, stepping back inside and leaning against the kitchen counter, you've got some pretty high expectations to meet now. Michael turned, a grin spreading across his face. Trust me, I deliver. Claire laughed, shaking her head. We'll see about that. Michael paused, his expression softening. You've been smiling more lately. I like it. Claire looked down, her cheeks flushing slightly. I guess I've had a lot to smile about. Michael walked over, leaning on the counter beside her. You've done so much to move forward, Claire. You should be proud of yourself. She met his gaze, her voice quiet. I am. For the first time, I feel like I'm living my life on my terms. And it feels incredible. Michael reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. You deserve it. Across the city, Jason sat in his office, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The letter he had written to Claire months ago lay on the desk, unopened. He hadn't sent it, unsure if it would make a difference, or if she even wanted to hear from him. Eric walked in, unannounced as usual. Still working late, I see. Jason looked up, exhaustion etched into his features. Some things never change. Eric sat down across from him, glancing at the letter. You're still holding on to that? Jason leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. What's the point? She's moved on. Eric studied him for a moment before speaking. Maybe she has, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't say what you need to say. Jason sighed, picking up the envelope. What if it's too late? Eric shrugged. It might be. But if you don't try, you'll always wonder. And trust me, that's worse. Jason nodded slowly, his mind churning. Finally, he slipped the letter into his jacket pocket. I'll think about it. The next evening, Claire and Michael sat on a park bench overlooking the river, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the city. A gentle breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves, and Claire felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. Michael handed her a cup of hot cocoa, his smile warm. You know, I was thinking about what you said the other night, about starting fresh. Claire took a sip, savoring the rich flavor. What about it? I think you've done more than start fresh, Michael said. You've rebuilt, and it's amazing to watch. Claire tilted her head, her smile soft. I couldn't have done it without people like you, Michael. You've been there through everything. Michael looked at her, his gaze steady. I'll always be here, Claire, no matter what. For a moment, they sat in silence, the connection between them deepening. Claire felt a warmth in her chest, a quiet certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. 2 days later, Claire received a package in the mail. She opened it to find Jason's letter, neatly folded inside. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the familiar handwriting. Claire, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I need to say these things. For years, I blamed you for how things ended between us. It was easier to project my own flaws onto you than to face them myself. Inviting you to the wedding was a mistake, not because you came, but because of why I invited you. I wanted to prove something to you, to myself. Instead, you proved something to me, that you've grown into the person I always wished I could be. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. But I hope you know that you've inspired me to try to be better, not for anyone else, but for myself. Thank you for being honest with me, even when I wasn't ready to hear it. I hope you found the happiness you deserve. Jason. Claire folded the letter, her emotions a mix of surprise and closure. She didn't feel anger or regret, just a sense of understanding. Michael noticed the shift in her expression as he walked into the room. Everything okay? Claire smiled, holding up the letter. It's from Jason. It's an apology, I guess. Michael sat beside her, his brow furrowed. How do you feel about it? Claire looked out the window, her voice steady, grateful. Not because I needed it, but because it feels like the last piece of the puzzle. I can finally move on completely. Michael nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. So, what now? Claire turned to him, her eyes bright. Now, I keep building the life I want, one step at a time. In the following months, Claire continued to flourish. She took on new projects, traveled to places she'd always dreamed of, and deepened her relationship with Michael. Jason, too, began to change. He stepped away from the relentless pursuit of perfection, focusing instead on rediscovering who he was outside of his carefully constructed image. Though their paths never crossed again, Claire and Jason found their own versions of peace, each learning that true happiness comes not from control or validation, but from living authentically. And so, with the chapters of their shared history finally closed, both of them stepped into the future, ready to write new stories of their own.